June 14th, 1943, 5:27 in the morning. The Norman countryside stretched endlessly beneath a pewter sky, where the first light of dawn caught dewdrops hanging like suspended diamonds from wheat stalks that swayed in the gentle breeze off the English Channel. 43 kilometers southeast of Caen, in the village of Saint-Pierre-du-Jonquet, the air carried the scent of wet earth, ripening grain, and the distant salt tang of the sea. The only sounds were the rhythmic creaking of wooden cartwheels on cobblestone and the soft lowing of cattle being led to pasture. In the stone farmhouse that had sheltered 5 generations of the Lemoine family, Jean-Baptiste Lemoine pushed open the heavy oak shutters of his bedroom window and breathed in the morning air. At 28, he possessed the weathered hands and sun-darkened skin of a man who had worked the land since childhood, his calloused fingers bearing testament to countless hours spent behind the plough, mending fences and coaxing life from soil that had known both abundance and famine. His brown hair, already showing premature streaks of grey at the temples, caught the morning light as he surveyed fields that had been his grandfather's legacy and would, God willing, someday belong to his own children. The farmhouse itself was unremarkable. Thick limestone walls built to withstand Norman winters, a slate roof that had weathered 2 centuries of storms, and windows deep set in their frames like watchful eyes. The barn that stood 50 meters from the main house appeared equally ordinary. Weathered oak beam, a foundation of fitted stones, and double doors that hung slightly askew on their iron hinges. To any casual observer, it was simply another agricultural building in a landscape dotted with such structures, as natural and unremarkable as the rolling hills themselves. But beneath the surface of this pastoral tranquility, something far more dangerous stirred. In the pre-dawn darkness, before even the roosters began their morning call, Jean had been awake in the barn's shadowy interior, his ear pressed to a device that would have meant his death if discovered. The soft crackle of static filled the space between the wooden support beams, punctuated by the rhythmic beeping of Morse code transmissions that travelled invisible paths through the atmosphere, carrying secrets that could alter the course of the war raging across Europe. From high above, the drone of aircraft engines began to echo across the Norman sky, American P-47 Thunderbolts beginning their morning patrol over the Luftwaffe airfields at Évreux and Bernay. Jean paused in his work, listening to that distant rumble, with the practiced ear of a man who had learned to distinguish between the throaty roar of American Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine and the higher-pitched whine of German BMW and Daimler-Benz power plant. Each sound told a story, revealed intentions, whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen. The morning light revealed a countryside that seemed untouched by war, yet every field and farmhouse concealed the reality of occupation. German soldiers had been billeted in the village, their presence as constant and oppressive as the morning mist that rolled in from the Channel. They had requisitioned the best houses for officers' quarters, converted the school into a communications centre, and established checkpoints on every road leading to the coast. Yet somehow, they had failed to notice that the simple farmer who repaired their broken tractors and sold them fresh eggs and milk was listening to their every conversation, cataloguing their every movement, and reporting their activities to controllers in London, who translated that intelligence into bombing coordinates and fighter squadron assignments. The transformation of Jean Lemoine from Norman farmer to Allied intelligence operative had begun not with patriotic speeches or clandestine recruitment, but with a single moment of crystalline moral clarity on a rain-soaked morning in November 1940, when German paratroopers had kicked down his door and systematically looted everything of value from the home where his grandmother lay dying. They had taken his father's military medals from the Great War, his mother's silver candlestick, and even the small savings hidden in a coffee tin beneath the kitchen floorboards, the money he had been setting aside to marry Marie Dubois, the baker's daughter from the next village. But it was not the theft that had hardened his heart against the occupiers. It was the casual indifference with which they had stepped over his grandmother's bed, their muddy boots tracking dirt across the quilts she had sewn by hand during her youth, treating a dying woman as nothing more than an obstacle to their systematic pillaging. That night, as he sat beside his grandmother's bedside and listened to her laboured breathing, Jean had made a quiet promise that would define the rest of his war. He would not take up arms like the Maquis in the forests, for his obligations to the farm and his remaining family made such dramatic gestures impossible. But he would find his own way to fight back. using the very ordinariness that made him invisible to the occupiers as both shield and weapon. He would become what the intelligence services would later classify as a stay-behind asset, a civilian operative who remained in place, living a normal life while gathering information and providing support for resistance activities. The first step had been the most difficult, making contact with Allied intelligence services without arousing suspicion. Through a network of connections that included the parish priest, a sympathetic gendarme, and a black market trader who moved freely between occupied and unoccupied zones, Jean had eventually established communication with the Special Operations Executive, the British organization responsible for supporting resistance movements across occupied Europe. The process had taken months of careful negotiations, coded messages passed through intermediaries, and security checks designed to weed out double agents and German provocateurs. When the connection was finally established, Jean received his first piece of specialized equipment, a compact radio transceiver disguised as farm equipment, along with detailed instructions for its operation and maintenance. The device itself was a marvel of wartime engineering, a British Type 3 Mark II wireless set that had been modified by SOE technicians to resemble the electrical components of a milking machine. The radio circuits were hidden inside a metal housing that appeared to be nothing more than a voltage regulator for automated dairy equipment, complete with fake meters and switches that served no actual purpose beyond maintaining the deception. The Germans stationed in Saint-Pierre-du-Jonquet had nicknamed him Der Stumme Bauer, the mute farmer. The designation was not entirely inaccurate, as Jean had cultivated a reputation for speaking only when spoken to, answering questions with monosyllabic grunts, and generally projecting the image of a simple-minded peasant whose mental faculties were entirely consumed by the seasonal rhythms of agricultural work. When German officers commandeered his barn for storage of supplies, or his house for billeting purposes, he would nod respectfully and accommodate their demands without complaint, his weathered face revealing nothing of the calculations running through his mind as he memorized unit designations, counted personnel, and noted equipment type. Hauptmann Klaus Weber, the Wehrmacht officer responsible for civilian affairs in the district, had developed a particular fondness for what he perceived as Jean's rustic simplicity. Weber, a career military man from Bavaria, who had spent his pre-war years as a bank clerk in Munich, found the Norman farmer's uncomplicated approach to life refreshingly different from the political complexities and moral ambiguities that characterized his military service. During his weekly inspections of civilian properties, Weber would often pause at the Lemoyne farm to sample Marie's bread and Jean's cider, engaging in what he imagined were meaningful conversations about agricultural techniques and local weather patterns. Der Bauer versteht nur Kühe und Korn, Weber would tell his subordinates with patronizing affection. The farmer understands only cows and grain. This assessment was reinforced by Jean's carefully cultivated habit of responding to complex questions with puzzled expressions and redirecting conversations toward topics like soil conditions, rainfall amounts, and livestock breeding practices. When German soldiers brought their damaged equipment to his workshop, Jean would examine each piece with the methodical attention of a craftsman whose expertise was limited to mechanical problems, never betraying any interest in the strategic or tactical application was fixing. The deception was so complete that German personnel had begun using Jean's workshop as an unofficial repair facility for sensitive communications equipment, confident that the simple farmer who fixed their radios and generators possessed neither the technical knowledge to understand their function, nor the intellectual curiosity to ask dangerous questions. Obergefreiter Heinrich Müller, the signal specialist responsible for maintaining communications between the local garrison and regional headquarters, had actually trained Jean to perform basic maintenance procedures on German radio equipment, patiently explaining the function of various components, while Jean nodded with the attentive expression of a devoted student learning to service farm machinery. Er ist wie ein treuer Hund, Müller would say approvingly. He's like a faithful dog. The comparison was intended as a compliment, reflecting Müller's belief that Jean possessed the kind of reliable, unquestioning loyalty that characterized the best relationships between German occupiers and French civilians. The signals specialist had even begun leaving sensitive equipment in Jean's workshop overnight, confident that the farmer's moral limitations prevented him from understanding the implications of what surrounded him, much less developing the initiative necessary for acts of sabotage or espionage. This fundamental misreading of Jean's character and capabilities extended throughout the German command structure in the region. Colonel Friedrich Hartmann, the senior Wehrmacht officer responsible for coastal defense preparations between Caen and Bayeux, had specifically cited the cooperation of farmers like Jean Lemoine as evidence that the Norman population was adapting successfully to German administration. In reports to his superiors, Hartmann described the local civilian population as politically passive and economically cooperative, noting with particular satisfaction that agricultural production had actually increased under German supervision, thanks to what he perceived as improved management practices and the stabilizing influence of military discipline. The irony was profound and systematic. German officers who prided themselves on their tactical intelligence and strategic acumen had created, through their own cultural arrogance and racial prejudices, the perfect conditions for their enemies to operate with impunity. Their assumption that French peasants were inherently simple-minded and politically unsophisticated blinded them to the possibility that apparent cooperation might mask sophisticated resistance activities. Their belief in German technological and organizational superiority prevented them from recognizing that their own communication security was being systematically compromised by the very people they had dismissed as intellectually inferior. Jean's workshop had become, without the Germans' knowledge, an intelligence goldmine where sensitive equipment was regularly photographed, technical specifications were copied, and operational frequencies were monitored. The same radio components that Müller taught Jean to repair were being used to intercept German communications and relay that intelligence to Allied forces. The mechanical skills that Weber admired as evidence of honest peasant craftsmanship were being employed to modify captured German equipment for use in resistance. Even the cider that German officers praised for its authentic Norman character was being served in glasses that had been carefully positioned to encourage loose talk about military operations and strategic planning. The Germans' casual racism had created a blind spot so complete that they literally could not see the intelligence operation unfolding before their eyes. Their certainty that French farmers lacked the sophistication necessary for complex technical operation prevented them from recognizing that Jean's workshop contained some of the most advanced radio equipment in Normandy. Their assumption that peasant loyalty could be purchased with small privileges and minor courtesies made them incapable of imagining that their apparent cooperation was actually a carefully orchestrated deception designed to gather intelligence for their enemies. The radio equipment that formed the backbone of Jean's intelligence operation represented the culmination of 3 years of technical innovation driven by the desperate circumstances of Britain's solitary resistance against Nazi Germany. The Type 3 Mark II wireless set concealed in his barn had been developed by the Inter-Services Research Bureau, a classified organization within the Special Operations Executive, responsible for creating specialized equipment for resistance operations across occupied Europe. The device itself was a masterpiece of miniaturization and concealment, incorporating advanced vacuum tube technology, frequency hopping capabilities, and power consumption optimization that allowed for extended operation using improvised power sources. The technical specifications were impressive for equipment designed to operate in hostile territory with minimal maintenance support. The transmitter could generate up to 15 watts of radio frequency power across a range of frequencies from 3.2 to 16.8 MHz, providing coverage for both short-range tactical communications and long-range strategic reporting. The receiver section employed super-heterodyne circuitry with automatic frequency control, ensuring stable reception even when atmospheric conditions degraded signal quality. Most importantly for an operative like Jean, the entire system could be broken down into components that resembled common agricultural or industrial equipment, allowing for concealment that would pass all but the most detailed technical inspection. The power supply arrangements required particular ingenuity, as conventional electrical service in rural France was unreliable and could be monitored by German authorities seeking to identify unusual consumption patterns. Jean's setup utilized a combination of sources: a 6-volt tractor battery for primary power, supplemented by a hand-cranked generator that could provide emergency power during extended transmission sessions. The antenna system was perhaps the most vulnerable component, requiring careful concealment within the farm's existing infrastructure. Jean had solved this problem by incorporating antenna elements into the metal framework of his barn, disguising the radio frequency conductors as lightning rods and equipment grounding systems that appeared to serve legitimate agricultural purposes. The encryption and communication protocols employed by Jean's operation reflected lessons learned from earlier resistance networks that had been compromised by German cryptographic analysis and direction-finding operations. Instead of relying on book codes or simple substitution ciphers that could be broken through statistical analysis, Jean used a one-time pad system based on random number sequences generated in London and delivered through secure channels. Each transmission was encrypted using a unique key that would never be repeated, making cryptographic analysis virtually impossible, even if individual messages were intercepted and recorded. The operational schedule was designed to minimize the risk of detection through direction-finding techniques that the Germans employed to locate clandestine radio operations. Rather than transmitting at regular intervals that would establish a pattern, Jean's broadcasts were scheduled according to seemingly random timing that was actually coordinated with specific intelligence requirements and atmospheric propagation conditions. Transmission sessions were kept brief, typically lasting no more than 3 to 5 minutes, and were spread across multiple frequencies to prevent German radio monitoring stations from establishing accurate bearings through triangulation. The intelligence collection and reporting procedures reflected sophisticated understanding of German military organization and tactical doctrine. Rather than attempting to gather information about every aspect of German operations in his area, Jean focused on specific categories of intelligence that Allied planners had identified as critical for strategic decision-making. Primary emphasis was placed on Luftwaffe operations, particularly the activities of Jagdgeschwader 26 and Jagdgeschwader 2, the fighter units responsible for intercepting Allied bombing missions over northern France. Jean's reports included detailed information about aircraft movements, pilot rotation schedule, fuel and ammunition supply deliveries, and most crucially, the radio frequencies and call signs used for tactical communications. The technical intelligence gathering capabilities built into Jean's operation extended far beyond simple observation and reporting. The workshop where he repaired German equipment had been converted into a sophisticated technical intelligence collection facility, complete with specialized tools for disassembling and photographing sensitive components. A modified camera designed for copying documents had been concealed within what appeared to be a standard mechanical vise, allowing Jean to photograph circuit diagrams, technical manuals, and operational orders while maintaining the pretense of performing routine maintenance procedures. The most valuable intelligence product generated by Jean's operation was detailed information about German radar installations and radio navigation systems along the Norman coast. Through systematic observation of equipment transport, installation activity, and testing procedures, Jean had compiled comprehensive reports about the location, capabilities, and operational characteristics of Freya early warning radar, Würzburg gun-laying radar, and the navigation beacon used by German night fighters. This information was directly responsible for the success of numerous Allied bombing missions, as RAF and USAAF planners used Jean's intelligence to select approach routes that avoided detection and to time attacks for maximum surprise effect. The communications network that linked Jean to Allied intelligence services was itself a technical marvel, involving multiple relay stations, frequency changes, and message routing procedures designed to prevent German monitoring stations from tracing communications back to their sources. Messages from Jean's radio first traveled to a relay station operated by French resistance networks in the Vosges Mountains, where they were re-encrypted and forwarded through Switzerland to MI6 stations in neutral Sweden. From there, the intelligence was transmitted to receiving stations in Scotland, decoded and analyzed by specialized intelligence units, and disseminated to operational commanders responsible for planning bombing missions and fighter sweeps over occupied France. The sophistication of these technical arrangements reflected the transformation of intelligence warfare that had occurred during the first 3 years of World War II. What had begun as a conflict between conventional military forces had evolved into a complex struggle involving electronic warfare, signals intelligence, and technological innovation on scales previously unimaginable. Jean's operation represented the cutting edge of this development, a fusion of advanced technology, sophisticated operational procedures, and individual human courage that exemplified the emergence of modern intelligence warfare as a decisive factor in military operations. July 23, 1940, 3:18 in the morning. The summer night hung thick and humid across the Norman countryside, the kind of oppressive atmosphere that preceded thunderstorm and made sleep elusive for soldiers and civilians alike. In his barn, Jean had been conducting his scheduled transmission to London, reporting on the arrival of new Focke-Wulf 190 fighters at the airfield near Évreux and the installation of additional flak batteries around the coastal radar. The transmission had run longer than usual, nearly 7 minutes, because atmospheric conditions required multiple repetitions of critical data about German fighter squadron strengths and operational readiness level. He had just completed the final encryption sequence and was preparing to power down the radio when he heard the sound that every resistance operative dreaded, the rumble of multiple vehicles approaching along the dirt road that led to his farm. Through a crack in the barn doors, Jean could see the distinctive blackout headlights of German military vehicles, their dim blue beams cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like the eyes of predatory animals stalking through the countryside. 3 vehicles, a Kübelwagen carrying an officer and driver, followed by 2 Opel Blitz trucks loaded with soldiers. The raid was systematic and professional, executed with the mechanical precision that characterized German security operations throughout occupied France. Soldiers surrounded the farmhouse and barn, while an Obergefreiter positioned himself at the main gate to prevent escape attempts. The officer in charge, Hauptmann Weber himself, approached the farmhouse with the confident stride of a man conducting a routine inspection, rather than a desperate search for evidence of resistance activity. But Jean knew from the hour and the force composition that this was no routine check. Someone had provided intelligence suggesting that illegal radio operations were being conducted in the area. Jean's hands moved with desperate efficiency, dismantling the radio equipment and concealing the components according to procedures he had practiced countless times but never expected to use under such extreme pressure. The transmitter and receiver sections were separated and hidden inside the false bottom of a grain barrel, while the antenna switch and power supply were concealed within the metal framework of a hay baler that sat in the corner of the barn. The encryption materials, the most damning evidence if discovered, were stuffed inside a leather pouch that was then inserted into a hollowed-out section of wooden beam that appeared to be nothing more than natural weathering damage. The entire concealment process took less than 90 seconds, but it felt like an eternity, while the sound of German voices grew louder and the beam of electric torches began probing the darkness around the farm building. Jean forced himself to move naturally, deliberately slowing his actions to avoid the appearance of panic or guilty haste. By the time the soldiers reached the barn doors, he was sitting on a wooden stool beside a dismantled tractor engine, apparently absorbed in the routine maintenance work that any farmer might undertake during the cooler hours of early morning. Was Maxter here? The question came from a young soldier, whose nervous energy suggested this was one of his first security operations. Jean looked up with the expression of mild confusion that had served him well throughout 3 years of German occupation, the look of a simple man interrupted in honest work by incomprehensible official business. Le moteur, Jean replied in broken German, gesturing toward the tractor parts scattered across his workbench. Motor kaputt. He had learned that speaking imperfect German actually enhanced his credibility with German soldiers, who interpreted his linguistic limitations as evidence of limited intelligence rather than deliberate concealment of his actual capabilities. Hauptmann Weber entered the barn with the confidence of a man conducting a familiar routine, his electric torch beams sweeping methodically across the interior space, while his experienced eye catalogued potential hiding places and suspicious details. Jean continued working on the tractor engine, his weathered hands steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins, occasionally glancing up with the patient expression of a craftsman, waiting for interruption to pass so he could return to important work. Interessant, Weber said, examining the electrical components of Jean's milking system with the attention of someone who possessed enough technical knowledge to distinguish between legitimate equipment and improvised modifications. Very modern for such a small farm. Where did you acquire such sophisticated electrical equipment? The question was delivered casually, but Jean recognized it as a test designed to elicit information about possible black market connections or unexplained sources of advanced. Mon père, he replied simply, maintaining the fiction that his father had installed the system before the war. Old German equipment, very good quality. The response was calculated to appeal to Weber's national pride, while explaining the presence of technology that might otherwise appear suspiciously advanced for a small Norman farm. Weber's examination of the barn continued for nearly 20 minutes, during which time Jean maintained his pose as a dedicated craftsman absorbed in mechanical repair work. The German officer inspected the electrical connection, examined the metal framework that concealed Jean's antenna system, and even opened several of the grain barrels where radio components were hidden. At one point, Weber's torch beam illuminated the exact barrel that contained the transmitter section of Jean's radio, and Jean felt his heart hammering against his ribs as the officer considered whether to investigate further. The moment that could have ended everything came when Weber discovered the electrical connections that powered Jean's radio system. The wiring was necessarily more complex than would be required for simple agricultural equipment, and Weber possessed enough technical knowledge to recognize the discrepancy. He traced the wires with his finger while Jean forced himself to continue working on the tractor engine, projecting an attitude of complete indifference to the officer's technical curiosity. "This electrical system," Weber said slowly, his voice carrying a note of suspicion that made the air in the barn feel suddenly thinner. "It appears more sophisticated than necessary for basic farm operations. Can you explain these additional circuits?" Jean set down his wrench and approached Weber with the eager expression of a craftsman, proud of his technical improvisation. "Milk machine," he said, using the German word for milking machine while gesturing toward the dairy equipment. "Electric milking system. My brother, he is electrician in Caen before the war. He helps me make modern system for cows." The explanation was delivered with the enthusiasm of someone sharing a prized technical achievement, complete with detailed gestures indicating how the electrical power flowed from the main supply to various pieces of equipment. Weber nodded thoughtfully, his suspicion apparently satisfied by Jean's detailed explanation and obvious pride in his electrical improvement. The German officer had encountered many French civilians who had modified their equipment using scavenged materials and improvised techniques, and Jean's story fit perfectly with his expectations about peasant ingenuity and resourcefulness. More importantly, Weber's cultural assumptions about French technical capabilities made it impossible for him to imagine that a simple farmer could construct and operate the kind of sophisticated radio equipment that would be required for espionage operations. The search concluded with Weber actually complimenting Jean on his technical skills and recommending that other farmers in the district consult with him about electrical improvements to their own operation. As the German vehicles disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, Jean remained in the barn, his hands shaking with the delayed reaction to mortal danger. He had passed the most dangerous test of his career as a resistance operative, but the experience left him with a profound understanding of how narrow the margin for error had become and how completely his survival depended on the Germans' continued underestimation of his capabilities and commitment. August 17th, 1943. The morning that would transform Jean Lemoine from a valuable intelligence asset into a strategic weapon in the Allied campaign for air superiority over occupied Europe began with an accident that revealed the true scope of what he had been unknowingly observing for months. While performing routine maintenance on a German Telefunken radio that had been damaged in a recent RAF bombing attack on the Evreux airfield, Jean discovered a component that would revolutionize his understanding of German fighter operations and provide Allied intelligence services with the breakthrough he'd been seeking. The radio belonged to Lieutenant Hans Brenner, a veteran Messerschmitt Bf 109 pilot from Jagdgeschwader 26, who had developed a reputation for aggressive tactics against American bomber formation. Brenner had brought the damaged radio to Jean's workshop with instructions to repair whatever was preventing proper reception of ground control frequencies, explaining with the casual arrogance typical of German aviators that French mechanics were adequate for simple repairs but lacked the technical sophistication necessary for complex electronic work. Jean had nodded with his characteristic expression of humble acceptance while mentally cataloguing every detail of Brenner's comments about radio frequencies, call signs, and tactical coordination procedure. The repair process itself was routine, until Jean discovered that the radio's frequency selection switch had been modified with additional positions that corresponded to wavelengths not normally used by standard Luftwaffe communications. More significantly, these additional frequencies were labeled with cryptic markings that suggested they were used for specialized communications related to what German pilots called Himmelbett, the integrated radar-controlled night fighter system that was causing devastating losses among RAF Bomber Command aircraft conducting nighttime operations over. Jean's technical training, acquired through years of repairing increasingly sophisticated equipment, allowed him to recognize that these modifications represented something far more important than simple communication improvement. The frequency ranges corresponded to radar control systems that provided German night fighters with precision guidance toward incoming bomber streams, while the specialized receivers allowed fighter pilots to monitor Allied communications and anticipate tactical changes during combat operations. In essence, Brenner's radio contained the technical specifications for the entire German air defense system in northwestern France. The discovery triggered a systematic analysis of similar equipment that Jean had previously repaired without fully understanding its significance. German pilots had been bringing modified radios to his workshop for months, assuming that his technical repairs were limited to mechanical problems and basic circuit troubleshooting. In reality, Jean had been inadvertently accumulating a comprehensive database of German electronic warfare capabilities, fighter control procedures, and radar system operating characteristics that represented the most valuable intelligence collection operation in occupied Europe. The implications were staggering. Every radio frequency, every call sign, every tactical coordination procedure that Jean had observed and dutifully reported to London was part of a larger system that Allied intelligence analysts could now understand in its complete operational context. The seemingly random information he had been gathering about aircraft movements, pilot schedules, and equipment modifications suddenly revealed itself as a detailed blueprint of German air defense capability that could be exploited to dramatically improve Allied bombing effectiveness and reduce aircraft losses. Jean's first instinct was to photograph the modified radio components and transmit the technical details to London as quickly as possible. But his experience with intelligence operations had taught him to think strategically about information value and operational security, rather than risk exposure through a single massive intelligence transmission that might attract German attention. He developed a plan to systematically document the complete German fighter control system through careful examination of equipment that pilots continued to bring to his workshop. The intelligence collection process that followed represented the transformation of Jean's operation from tactical observation to strategic intelligence gathering. Each radio repair became an opportunity to photograph technical components, copy frequency allocations, and record operational procedure. Jean's workshop became a technical intelligence laboratory where German pilots unknowingly provided detailed briefings about their combat tactics, communication protocols, and radar coordination procedures while waiting for their equipment to be repaired. The breakthrough came when Jean realized that the German fighter control system was fundamentally vulnerable to the same electronic warfare techniques that the British had been developing for their own radar operations. The frequencies used for radar control communications could be jammed or spoofed using relatively simple equipment, while the tactical coordination procedures followed predictable patterns that could be anticipated and countered through proper planning. Most importantly, the entire system depended on precise timing and coordination that could be disrupted through carefully planned interference with key communications channels. Within weeks of Jean's discovery, Allied intelligence services had distributed his technical intelligence to electronic warfare specialists, radar countermeasures units, and tactical planning staffs throughout the European theatre of operations. The information was used to develop new jamming techniques, modify bomber approach routes to avoid radar coverage, and coordinate fighter escort operations to exploit weaknesses in German defensive procedures. The impact on combat effectiveness was immediate and dramatic. Allied bombing accuracy improved significantly, while aircraft losses decreased to the lowest levels since the beginning of strategic bombing operations over Europe. The strategic significance of Jean's intelligence breakthrough extended far beyond its immediate tactical applications. By revealing the technical foundations of German air defense capability, his discoveries enabled Allied planners to understand how German tactical doctrine would evolve in response to changing battlefield conditions. This predictive capability allowed Allied forces to anticipate German tactical innovations and develop countermeasures before new defensive techniques could be implemented effectively. Perhaps most importantly, Jean's intelligence revelations demonstrated that German technological superiority was less absolute than previously assumed. The sophisticated radar systems and electronic coordination procedures that made German air defenses so effective were also sources of vulnerability that could be exploited through careful analysis and targeted countermeasures. This recognition fundamentally altered Allied strategic planning, shifting emphasis from attempts to overwhelm German defenses through superior numbers toward more sophisticated approaches that exploited technological and tactical weaknesses. The transformation of Jean's role from passive observer to active intelligence warrior was completed when London authorized him to begin conducting electronic warfare operations using modified German equipment that had been repaired with additional capability. His workshop became a base for radio frequency jamming operations, tactical communications interception, and the coordination of electronic countermeasures that supported Allied bombing missions throughout northwestern France. The simple farmer, who had begun his resistance career by reporting aircraft movements, had become a sophisticated electronic warfare specialist whose activities directly influenced the outcome of air operations across the European theatre. September 1943 through March 1944. The autumn and winter months that followed Jean's technical breakthrough witnessed the systematic transformation of Allied air operations over northwestern France, as intelligence derived from his electronic surveillance activities revolutionized tactical planning and operational effectiveness. What had begun as a single farmer's resistance to German occupation had evolved into a comprehensive electronic warfare campaign that touched every aspect of the air war over Europe. The operational statistics told the story with brutal mathematical precision. In August 1943, before Jean's technical discoveries were fully implemented, Allied bomber losses over northwestern France averaged 7.3% per mission, a casualty rate that was unsustainable for continued strategic bombing operations. By December 1943, after his intelligence had been incorporated into tactical planning procedures and electronic warfare technique, loss rates had decreased to 2.1%, while bombing accuracy had improved by more than 40%. The transformation was so dramatic that German fighter commanders began reporting systematic failures in their radar control system and communication networks without understanding that their difficulties were being caused by a French farmer operating from a barn in Normandy. Jean's intelligence network had expanded far beyond his original workshop operation to encompass a web of technical specialists, resistance operatives, and sympathetic civilians who provided detailed surveillance of German air operations across a region stretching from the Channel coast to the outskirts of Paris. Railroad workers reported the movement of aviation fuel and ammunition shipment, allowing Allied planners to predict when German fighter squadrons would be most vulnerable to attack. Parish priests monitored German pilot rotation schedules and reported changes in unit assignments that indicated tactical reorganization or equipment upgrades. Even French women employed as cleaning staff at German installations provided intelligence about radio equipment modifications and communication procedure changes. The coordination of these diverse intelligence sources required sophisticated analysis techniques that transformed raw observation data into actionable tactical intelligence. Jean's workshop had been equipped with additional radio equipment and analysis tools that allowed him to intercept German fighter control communications in real time and relay tactical information directly to Allied bomber formations during combat operations. This capability, unprecedented in resistance operations, enabled Allied aircraft to receive immediate warnings about German fighter movements and adjust their tactics accordingly during ongoing missions. The electronic warfare aspects of Jean's operation had grown to encompass sophisticated jamming and deception techniques that systematically degraded German air defense effectiveness. Using modified German radio equipment that pilots continued to bring to his workshop for repair, Jean conducted targeted jamming operations against specific radar and fighter control. The jamming was carefully coordinated with Allied bombing missions to create maximum disruption of German defensive coordination without revealing the source of the interference. More insidiously, Jean had begun conducting what intelligence specialists termed tactical deception operations, using captured German radio equipment to transmit false information on frequencies that German controllers monitored for operational intelligence. These deception transmissions included false aircraft movement reports, fabricated damage assessments, and misleading tactical information that caused German fighter controllers to deploy their resources ineffectively during critical phases of Allied bombing operations. The psychological impact on German air crews was as significant as the tactical advantages gained through technical superiority. Veteran pilots who had previously felt confident in their sophisticated radar control systems and electronic coordination procedures began reporting mysterious communication failures, inexplicable radar anomalies, and coordination breakdowns that seemed to occur precisely when Allied bombing formations were most vulnerable to interception. The steady erosion of confidence in their technical systems contributed to declining morale and increasing combat stress among German aircrew members who could no longer rely on the electronic support systems that had previously given them tactical advantages over Allied aircraft. German intelligence services recognized that their air defense systems were being systematically compromised, but their investigation efforts were hampered by the same cultural assumptions that had allowed Jean's operation to remain undetected for so long. Security specialists concentrated their search efforts on urban areas and known resistance strongholds, while overlooking the possibility that sophisticated electronic warfare operations could be conducted from rural locations by personnel with apparent agricultural occupations. Their assumption that technical expertise was concentrated in industrial centers prevented them from considering that advanced intelligence operations might be based in farming communities. The strategic implications of Jean's electronic warfare activities extended far beyond their immediate impact on Allied bombing effectiveness. The intelligence he provided enabled Allied planners to understand German tactical doctrine with unprecedented precision, allowing for the development of countermeasures that anticipated German tactical innovations before they could be implemented effectively. This predictive capability gave Allied forces a decisive advantage in the evolving technological competition that characterized air warfare over Europe. The operational tempo of Jean's intelligence activities increased dramatically as Allied preparations for the invasion of Europe intensified throughout the winter and spring of 1944. His reports on German radar installations, anti-aircraft positions, and fighter squadron dispositions became critical components of the tactical planning for Operation Overlord, providing detailed intelligence about defensive capabilities that would oppose Allied air operations during the invasion itself. The precision and comprehensiveness of his intelligence report had made him one of the most valuable intelligence assets in the European theatre of operations. By March 1944, Jean's network was providing real-time intelligence support for specific Allied bombing missions, transmitting tactical information that allowed bomber formations to adjust their approach routes and timing to exploit temporary weaknesses in German air defenses. This level of tactical coordination between resistance intelligence sources and active military operations was unprecedented and demonstrated the evolution of modern warfare toward integrated intelligence and operational systems that blurred the traditional boundaries between military and civilian participation in combat operations. The success of Jean's electronic warfare activity had also attracted the attention of German security services, who were finally beginning to understand that their air defense problems were being caused by systematic intelligence compromise rather than random equipment failure. The Abwehr had initiated a comprehensive investigation into possible radio intelligence operations in the region, employing direction-finding equipment and surveillance teams specifically trained to detect clandestine communication activity. The net was closing around Jean's operation with methodical German precision, setting the stage for a confrontation that would test every aspect of his operational security and personal courage. The transformation of the air war over northwestern France had become undeniable by early 1940. German fighter pilots, who had once spoken confidently about their technological advantages, now reported widespread communication failures and coordination breakdowns that seemed to occur with suspicious frequency during critical combat operations. Luftwaffe technical specialists documented systematic patterns of radar interference and communication jamming that suggested the presence of sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities among resistance forces. Most ominously for Jean's continued survival, German intelligence analysts had begun to correlate these electronic warfare activities with specific geographic regions, gradually narrowing their search area through systematic elimination of possible operational locations. The stakes of Jean's intelligence war had escalated beyond the immediate tactical advantages gained through electronic surveillance and jamming operation. His activities had become integral to Allied strategic planning for the invasion of Europe, providing intelligence that would influence the deployment of thousands of aircraft and the lives of tens of thousands of aircrew members. The simple farmer, who had begun his resistance career by observing German aircraft movements, had become a critical component of the most complex military operation in human history, bearing responsibilities that extended far beyond his original intentions or expectations. April 15th, 1944. Dawn. The morning that would define Jean Lemoyne's legacy as one of the most effective intelligence operatives in the European theatre of operations began with the kind of spring clarity that made the Norman countryside appear almost ethereally beautiful despite the machinery of war that had transformed it into a strategic battlefield. The apple trees were in full bloom, their white and pink blossoms creating a pastoral scene that might have inspired the Impressionist painters who had once found inspiration in these same rolling hills and ancient stone farmhouses. But beneath this surface tranquility, the machinery of modern warfare was preparing for the most decisive confrontation between Allied intelligence operations and German security services that had occurred since the beginning of the occupation. 3 separate German investigation teams had converged on the Saint-Pierre-du-Jonquet area, equipped with sophisticated direction-finding equipment and detailed intelligence about the electronic warfare activities that had been systematically degrading Luftwaffe effectiveness throughout northwestern France. The German investigation was being coordinated by Sturmbannführer Karl Brenner, not related to the pilot whose radio had provided Jean's initial breakthrough, but a veteran Gestapo specialist in counterintelligence operations who had earned his reputation by dismantling resistance networks across occupied Europe. Brenner possessed the kind of methodical intelligence and ruthless determination that made him particularly dangerous to operations like Jean's, which depended on maintaining the appearance of normalcy while conducting sophisticated technical activities that required specialized equipment. Jean had been monitoring German radio communications for weeks, tracking the gradual concentration of security forces in his area and recognizing that his operational security was approaching the breaking point. The electronic signatures generated by his radio equipment were becoming increasingly difficult to conceal as German direction-finding capabilities improved and investigation techniques became more sophisticated. More importantly, the pattern of successful Allied bombing operations that corresponded with his intelligence reports was creating a statistical correlation that even relatively unsophisticated analysis could detect. The final confrontation began at 5:30 in the morning, when Jean detected radio communications, indicating that German security teams were implementing a systematic search pattern designed to isolate and identify the source of electronic warfare activity in the region. The search teams were using triangulation techniques to narrow their investigation area, while mobile direction-finding units monitored radio frequencies for any transmission that might reveal the location of clandestine communication equipment. Jean's response demonstrated the sophisticated operational planning that had kept his intelligence network functioning for nearly 4 years, despite increasingly intense German security efforts. Rather than attempting to flee or destroy his equipment, actions that would confirm German suspicions while eliminating his intelligence capabilities, he implemented a deception plan that had been prepared months in advance for exactly this contingency. The deception involved using his network of resistance contacts to generate false electronic signatures that would mislead German direction-finding operations, while simultaneously transmitting critical intelligence to London about German defensive preparations for the anticipated Allied invasion. Multiple resistance cells across the region activated concealed radio equipment and began transmitting coded messages designed to create the appearance of a widespread communication network, with its operational center located far from Jean's actual position. While German security teams pursued these false leads, Jean conducted what he knew would be his final intelligence transmission from the barn where his resistance career had begun. The message he sent to London contained the complete technical specifications for German radar installations along the Normandy coast, detailed information about Luftwaffe squadron dispositions and operational procedures, and precise coordinates for anti-aircraft positions that would oppose Allied air operations during the invasion. The transmission lasted exactly 7 minutes and 33 seconds, far longer than normal operational security protocols would permit, but necessary to convey the massive amount of intelligence that Jean had accumulated over months of systematic observation. Every detail of German air defense capabilities that he had discovered was compressed into encrypted format and transmitted through atmospheric conditions that provided optimal propagation characteristics for long-range communication. As the transmission concluded and Jean began the final destruction of his radio equipment, he could hear the sound of German vehicles approaching along the country road that led to his farm. But the sound carried a different quality than previous security operations. This was not a routine search or investigation, but a systematic operation designed to capture or eliminate the source of intelligence activities that had been compromising German air defenses for months. The psychological dimensions of the confrontation extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Jean understood that his capture would not only end his own resistance activities, but would also compromise the broader intelligence network that had grown around his operation. Dozens of French civilians who had provided information, technical support, and logistical assistance could be identified through interrogation techniques that the Gestapo had perfected through years of counterintelligence operations across occupied Europe. More significantly, Jean's intelligence activities had become so integral to Allied strategic planning that his capture could potentially compromise preparations for the invasion of Europe itself. The detailed intelligence he had provided about German defensive capabilities was being used to plan air operations, select landing sites, and coordinate tactical procedures that would influence the lives of hundreds of thousands of Allied personnel. His continued silence under interrogation had become a strategic imperative that extended far beyond his personal survival or the protection of his immediate associates. The decision he made in those final moments before German security teams reached his farm demonstrated the moral transformation that had occurred during his 4 years as an intelligence operative. The simple farmer, who had begun his resistance career motivated primarily by personal outrage at German treatment of his grandmother, had evolved into a strategic thinker who understood that individual sacrifice was sometimes necessary to achieve larger objectives that transcended personal survival or immediate tactical considerations. Jean's final actions were characterized by the same methodical precision that had made his intelligence operations so effective. He destroyed his radio equipment and encryption materials using thermite charges that had been prepared months in advance, ensuring that no technical intelligence could be recovered, even if the Germans conducted detailed forensic examination of his workshop. He systematically eliminated all physical evidence of his intelligence activities while preserving the appearance that his workshop was used exclusively for legitimate agricultural purposes. Most importantly, he activated a dead-drop communication system that would allow his intelligence network to continue functioning even if he was captured or eliminated. Messages containing final intelligence updates and instructions for continued resistance activities were concealed in locations that could be accessed by other network members without compromising their operational security. The intelligence war that had begun with a single farmer's moral outrage had evolved into a systematic operation that could survive the loss of its founding operative. When Sturmbannführer Brenner and his security teams finally reached Jean's farm, they found only an empty barn, scattered farming equipment, and a small pile of ashes where sophisticated radio equipment had been completely destroyed. Jean himself had disappeared, leaving behind only a handwritten note in careful French script that read, "Vous avez des tanks, nous avons des oreilles. FB, you have tanks, we have ears. FB." The psychological impact of Jean's disappearance on German security operations was profound and demoralizing. Despite months of systematic investigation using sophisticated technical equipment and experienced personnel, they had failed to capture or even identify the source of intelligence activities that had been compromising their air defense capabilities. The realization that a single French operative had systematically outmaneuvered their entire counterintelligence apparatus challenged fundamental assumptions about German technical and organizational superiority that had sustained their confidence throughout 4 years of occupation. More significantly for the broader course of the war, Jean's intelligence legacy continued to influence Allied operations long after his disappearance from occupied France. The technical intelligence he had gathered about German air defense systems provided the foundation for electronic warfare techniques that were used throughout the invasion of Europe and subsequent strategic bombing operations. His detailed reports about German tactical procedures enabled Allied planners to anticipate defensive responses and develop countermeasures that saved thousands of Allied lives during combat operations. June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach. As Allied landing craft approached the Norman coastline through the pre-dawn darkness, the electronic warfare techniques developed from Jean Lemoyne's intelligence reports were already at work, jamming German radar installations and disrupting communication systems that might have provided early warning of the massive invasion. The sophisticated air defense network that had once protected occupied France was systematically neutralized by countermeasures derived from intelligence gathered in a barn 43 kilometers from the beaches, where the future of Europe would be decided. The Allied air operations that supported Operation Overlord demonstrated the strategic value of Jean's intelligence contributions with devastating effective. American P-47, Thunderbolts, and P-51 Mustangs swept across Norman airfields using detailed intelligence about German aircraft dispositions and fuel supplies that Jean had reported months earlier. British Lancaster and Halifax bombers struck radar installations and communication centers with precision that reflected intimate knowledge of German defensive capabilities. The Luftwaffe's response was fragmentary and ineffective, hampered by communication failures and coordination breakdowns that echoed the electronic warfare techniques Jean had pioneered during his 4 years of resistance activities. Major Richard Hale of the Special Operations Executive, reading after-action reports in a London command bunker as reports of successful landings arrived throughout the morning of June the 6th, understood the connection between the intelligence provided by Farmer Blue and the tactical success of Allied air operations over Normandy. The detailed technical intelligence that Jean had risked his life to gather had enabled Allied forces to achieve air superiority so complete that German ground force would receive virtually no air support throughout the critical first days of the invasion. He fought with silence and steel, Hale wrote in his operational summary, conducting a war that history will never fully document, but whose effects will resonate through every successful mission, every aircraft that returns safely, every life that is preserved through superior intelligence and tactical preparation. The type of warfare that remains invisible to conventional historical analysis, but proves decisive in determining the outcome of conventional military operations. The statistical validation of Jean's intelligence contributions became apparent as Allied forces consolidated their foothold in Normandy and began advancing inland. German air resistance, which had been anticipated as a major threat to invasion operations, proved surprisingly ineffective due to communication failures, fuel shortages, and tactical confusion that could be traced directly to intelligence Jean had provided about Luftwaffe capabilities and procedures. The comprehensive understanding of German air defense systems that his reports had enabled allowed Allied planners to exploit weaknesses and anticipate responses with unprecedented accuracy. By July 1944, as Allied forces broke through German defensive positions and began the rapid advance toward Paris, the broader strategic implications of Jean's intelligence work had become undeniable. The air superiority that proved crucial to the success of Operation Overlord had been achieved not simply through superior numbers or more advanced aircraft, but through systematic exploitation of German vulnerabilities that had been identified and analyzed through intelligence operations conducted by French civilians operating behind enemy lines. The human cost of Jean's intelligence activity extended far beyond his own disappearance from occupied France. German security operations triggered by their investigation of his activities resulted in the arrest and execution of dozens of French civilians who had provided information or support for resistance operations. The systematic German response to their inability to locate and eliminate Jean's network included reprisal actions against entire communities suspected of harboring resistance sympathizers, adding another dimension to the moral complexity of intelligence warfare that placed civilian populations at risk to achieve military objectives. Yet the strategic benefits of Jean's intelligence contributions were measured not only in tactical advantages gained, but in lives saved through superior preparation and planning. The reduced loss rates among Allied bomber crews conducting operations over northwestern France represented thousands of individual lives preserved through intelligence that enabled more effective routing, better tactical coordination, and more accurate assessment of German defensive capabilities. The mathematical relationship between intelligence effectiveness and casualty reduction provided concrete validation of the strategic value represented by operations like Jean's. The technical legacy of Jean's intelligence work influenced the development of electronic warfare that would be employed throughout the remainder of World War II and would provide the foundation for intelligence collection methods used in subsequent conflict. The integration of human intelligence, gathering with electronic surveillance and technical analysis that characterized his operation, became a template for modern intelligence operations that combined multiple sources and analytical techniques to achieve comprehensive understanding of enemy capabilities and intentions. Perhaps most significantly, Jean's story demonstrated that individual courage and technical competence could achieve strategic effects that rivaled the contributions of entire military units. The simple farmer who had begun his resistance career by reporting aircraft movements had ultimately influenced the deployment and effectiveness of thousands of aircraft and the lives of tens of thousands of military personnel through intelligence operations that required no elaborate organizational structure or sophisticated technological support beyond his own determination and ingenuity. The mystery of Jean's ultimate fate remained classified in British intelligence archives for decades after the war's conclusion, but circumstantial evidence suggests that he successfully escaped from occupied France and continued his intelligence activities from other locations until the liberation of Europe was complete. Unconfirmed reports place him in various locations throughout the European theatre, always conducting technical intelligence operations that supported Allied air operations through the same combination of technical expertise and systematic observation that had characterized his work in Normandy. In 1952, a restored P-47 Thunderbolt flew over the village of Saint-Pierre-du-Jonquet during a commemoration ceremony honoring French resistance activities. Local residents reported that the aircraft performed a series of aerobatic maneuvers directly above the farm, where Jean Lemoine had conducted his intelligence operations, as if acknowledging a debt that could never be fully documented in official historical record, but would be remembered by those who understood the connection between individual courage and collective achievement. The small museum established in the reconstructed barn displays artifacts from the German occupation period, alongside modern communication equipment that demonstrates the evolution of the technical capabilities that Jean had employed with such devastating effect. A simple metal barrel sits in one corner, bearing a plaque that reads, Jean Lemoine, alias Farmer Bleu, celui qui a parlé pour les cieux, he who spoke for the skies. The exhibit concludes with a recorded message that captures the essence of Jean's contribution to the Allied victory. While fighter aircraft dueled in the clouds above, one man on the ground transformed silence into a weapon, demonstrating that wars are won not only through superior firepower and tactical skill, but through the courage of individuals who choose to resist tyranny, using whatever tools and opportunities are available to them. The broader historical lesson of Jean's story extends beyond its immediate military significance to illuminate the role of civilian resistance in modern warfare and the ways in which individual moral courage can achieve strategic effects that influence the outcome of conflicts involving entire nations. His transformation from simple farmer to sophisticated intelligence operative demonstrates the potential for ordinary people to make extraordinary contributions when confronted with circumstances that demand moral clarity and personal sacrifice. The technical intelligence that Jean provided to Allied forces represented more than tactical information. It embodied the systematic application of human observation and technical analysis to achieve strategic objectives that could not have been accomplished through conventional military means alone. His work demonstrated that intelligence warfare had evolved into a discipline requiring individual courage, technical competence, and strategic thinking that rivaled the contributions of conventional military organizations in determining the outcome of modern conflicts. The enduring significance of Jean's story lies not in the specific technical details of his intelligence operations, or the tactical advantages his reports provided to Allied forces, but in the demonstration that individual commitment to moral principles can achieve effects that resonate far beyond immediate circumstances. The simple farmer who chose to resist German occupation through systematic intelligence gathering ultimately influenced the liberation of an entire continent through activities that required no authorization from military commanders, no sophisticated organizational structure, and no advanced technological support, beyond his own determination to use his skills and opportunities in service of larger principles. History isn't just written, it's remembered through those who still care to listen. The legacy of Jean Lemoine reminds us that the most decisive battles are sometimes fought not by armies, but by individuals who choose to resist tyranny using whatever tools and opportunities are available to them. In barns and workshops, in fields and villages, ordinary people made extraordinary contributions to the preservation of freedom through the simple act of refusing to accept that occupation was permanent or that resistance was futile. What story should we tell next? Subscribe to keep their memory alive.